Her texts suddenly stop. Phone calls go to voicemail. The woman who was enthusiastically engaged with you just yesterday has vanished into complete silence. If you've ever experienced this sudden communication blackout, you know the mental torture it creates. You were left checking your phone every 5 minutes, wondering what happened, and your mind starts racing through worst-case scenarios. Did I say something wrong? Is she with someone else? Has she completely lost interest? The psychological impact of female silence is brutal because it triggers every insecurity a man can have. But here's what most guys completely misunderstand. Her silence is rarely about absence of interest. In fact, it's often communicating something much more significant than her words ever could. After studying relationship dynamics for over a decade and coaching hundreds of men through exactly these situations, I can tell you that female silence is actually a complex form of communication. It's not the absence of a message, it is the message. And correctly interpreting this silence will completely transform how you handle these moments and the outcomes you create. The problem is that men and women operate on fundamentally different communication frequencies. What feels like confusing behavior to you is perfectly logical from her psychological perspective. Understanding this gap is the difference between mishandling these critical moments and turning them into opportunities for deeper connection. I get how maddening this situation is. One day, everything seems great, and the next day you re-ghosted with zero explanation. You start obsessively reviewing your last interactions, looking for what you might have done wrong. You consider sending multiple follow-up texts, making emotional appeals, or demanding an explanation. Let me save you from these mistakes right now. The psychological triggers that create female silence are specific and predictable, and your response needs to be equally strategic. Most men react in ways that actually make the situation dramatically worse, turning temporary silence into permanent disconnection. The female mind processes conflict, attraction, and emotional testing very differently than the male mind. Where men tend to address issues directly through verbal confrontation, women often use withdrawal and silence as primary tools for expressing dissatisfaction or testing emotional resilience. This isn't AT manipulation. It's a deeply ingrained pattern rooted in both evolutionary psychology and social conditioning. Understanding these patterns will allow you to accurately interpret what her silence actually means, instead of projecting your worst fears onto the situation. The first key understanding is that female silence almost always serves a specific psychological purpose. When she goes quiet, the first possibility to consider is what behavior experts call attention confirmation testing. This happens when she temporarily withdraws to confirm your level of investment and interest. It's like when you holding something loosely and someone tries to take it, your grip naturally tightens. She's essentially checking if your attention and interest are genuine or merely convenient. Will you notice her absence? Will it affect you? Do you value the connection enough to recognize when it's disrupted? I worked with Brandon from Phoenix, whose girlfriend would periodically go quiet for a day or two. He'd panic and blow up her phone, thinking she was losing interest, when in reality, she was unconsciously testing his emotional investment. Once he understood this dynamic, he responded with calm confidence rather than desperation, and these silent periods dramatically decreased. Her unconscious need for attention confirmation was satisfied by his measured response rather than his panic. The second reason for her silence is what psychologists call emotional processing space. Women's brains are wired with more connections between emotional processing centers and verbal centers. This means emotional events often create a need for internal processing before verbal expression becomes possible. When something upsets her or creates confusion, she may go silent not to punish you, but because she literally needs to process her feelings before she can articulate them. This silence isn't a tea about you, it's about her internal emotional calibration. Jake from Boston was dating a woman who would go quiet after any minor disagreement. He'd immediately try to force conversation to fix things, which only extended her silence. When he learned to give her space for this emotional processing, their communication dramatically improved. By respecting her silence rather than fighting against it, he allowed her natural processing cycle to complete instead of interrupting it. Most men make the critical mistake of trying to verbally resolve something that isn't ready for verbal resolution yet. The third common reason for female silence is what relationship experts call power rebalancing. If she feels the dynamic has become uneven, perhaps you've been less attentive, taking her for granted, or showing inconsistent interest. Silence becomes a way to reset the relational equilibrium. It's a subconscious attempt to restore her sense of value in the relationship. This isn't AT game playing. It's an instinctive response to perceived imbalance. The female mind is extraordinarily sensitive to relationship dynamics, and silence is often her most powerful tool for addressing imbalances that conversation can too easily fix. The fourth reason for her silence is what psychologists call attraction amplification. This might surprise you, but sometimes her silence is actually about increasing your attraction to her. The human brain is wired to value what becomes suddenly scarce. When she creates an unexpected absence, your brain automatically assigns higher value to her attention. It's basic neuroscience. This is MIT calculated manipulation. It's an intuitive understanding of attraction dynamics that women develop through social experience. The sudden contrast between consistent communication and silence creates a psychological tension that often intensifies attraction rather than diminishing it. Tyler from Denver experienced this with a woman he'd been dating casually for a few weeks. Their communication had been constant until she suddenly went quiet for several days. When she re-engaged, he noticed his interest had actually intensified during her absence. This contrast effect in psychology is powerful. We notice and value changes more than constants. Her intuitive understanding of this principle created a natural attraction amplification that textbook romance strategies couldn't achieve. The fifth trigger for female silence is what relationship experts call emotional congruence assessment. When a woman senses a disconnect between your words and your actions, or between what you say and how you behave, she often goes silent to observe how you respond without her input. It's essentially a test of your authentic self versus your presentation self. Will you scramble to regain her attention, revealing insecurity? Will you react with anger, revealing entitlement? Or will you remain confident and consistent, confirming emotional stability? Her silence creates a psychological canvas where your true patterns become more visible without the distraction of active communication. I worked with Kevin from Nashville, who could not understand why his girlfriend went completely silent after he made elaborate promises about their future together. What he didn't realize was that his words had outpaced his demonstrated commitment, creating an incongruence she could feel but not easily articulate. Her silence wasn't a T rejection, it was assessment. She needed to see if his behavior without her active participation would align with his grand declarations. This testing mechanism helps women evaluate emotional truthfulness beyond words alone. The sixth common trigger for her silence is what psychologists call boundary enforcement. If she feels her expressed limits have been ignored or her previous communications disregarded, silence often becomes her default boundary reinforcement tool. Rather than repeating herself or escalating into conflict, she withdraws to communicate that the current dynamic is unacceptable. This is an ET passive-aggressive behavior. It's actually an alternative to aggression that many women develop through social conditioning. When direct confrontation feels unsafe or ineffective, silence becomes the clearest available signal that something needs to change. Mason from Chicago was completely blindsided when a woman he'd been seeing for 2 months suddenly stopped responding to his messages. After coaching, he realized he'd repeatedly dismissed her subtle expressions of discomfort about the pace of their physical relationship. Her silence was an arbitrary. It emerged precisely when her verbal boundaries proved ineffective. She was an ghosting him out of disinterest. She was enforcing boundaries he had failed to respect through more subtle means. The seventh and perhaps most misunderstood trigger for female silence is what relationship psychologists call low-risk vulnerability invitation. Sometimes her silence is actually creating space for you to show emotional depth or initiative that routine interactions don't really easily accommodate. The pause in normal communication patterns opens a psychological doorway for deeper connection if you're willing to step through it. Most men completely miss these opportunities, assuming her silence means decreased interest when it's actually an unconscious invitation to elevate the relationship's emotional authenticity. David from San Francisco had been dating someone for several weeks when communication suddenly became minimal. Instead of assuming the worst, he recognized the pattern and responded with thoughtful vulnerability, sharing a personal challenge he was facing and asking for her perspective. This broke the silence immediately and led to their most meaningful conversation yet. Her withdrawal wasn't quantity about creating distance. It was unconsciously creating space for a different level of connection than their established patterns allowed. Understanding these 7 psychological triggers helps explain why female silence emerges, But correctly identifying which one you are dealing with requires observational skills most men haven't developed. The context surrounding her silence provides crucial clues. Did it follow a specific interaction or event? Has the relationship dynamic shifted recently? Have you established consistent patterns she might be testing? Accurate interpretation requires looking beyond the silence itself to the circumstances that preceded it. The timing of her silence is particularly revealing. Silence that follows perceived disrespect or boundary crossing is usually about boundary enforcement. Silence that emerges during periods of heightened uncertainty often represents emotional processing. Silence that appears when things seem to be going exceptionally well frequently signals attention confirmation testing. These contextual clues are far more reliable indicators than trying to analyze her last message or interaction in isolation. Now that we understand why she goes silent, let's address how to respond effectively to each type of silence. The first strategy is what psychologists call matched reciprocity. This approach is particularly effective for attention confirmation testing and attraction amplification silence. The principle is straightforward: match her communication energy rather than exceeding it. If she's gone silent, resist the overwhelming urge to send multiple messages or make repeated calls. This desperate escalation confirms her unconscious suspicion that the relationship's emotional investment is imbalanced, extending rather than resolving the silence. I coached Alex from Los Angeles through this exact situation. After 3 great dates, the woman he was seeing suddenly stopped responding to texts. His instinct was to send increasingly urgent messages asking what was wrong. Instead, I guided him to match her reciprocity, stepping back and giving the silent space to breathe. When she eventually reached out 4 days later, their connection resumed with greater mutual interest. Had he bombarded her with messages, he would have failed her unconscious test of emotional security. The second effective response strategy is what communication experts call time-bounded patience. This works particularly well for emotional processing silence. Instead of pressuring her for immediate re-engagement, internally set a reasonable time frame based on their relationship context, perhaps 2-3 days for someone you've been dating a few weeks, or 5-7 days for a more established relationship. During this period, continue your normal life without chasing or expressing frustration. This approach demonstrates emotional stability while still maintaining appropriate boundaries around how long you'll accept complete silence. Sean from Denver was dating a woman who would periodically disappear for days after any minor disagreement. His previous pattern of constant check-ins during these silent periods only prolonged them. When he implemented time-bounded patience, giving her space while continuing his normal activities, her processing periods gradually shortened from days to hours. By removing the resistance against her natural emotional processing rhythm, he allowed it to complete more efficiently. The third response strategy for female silence is what relationship psychologists call value reinforcement without pursuit. This approach is particularly effective for power rebalancing silence. Instead of chasing or withdrawing completely, demonstrate your continued value through visible social proof and life engagement without directly pursuing her attention. The goal is showing rather than telling her what she's missing by withdrawing. This isn't about manipulation. It's about authentically continuing your value-driven life regardless of her temporary absence. Ryan from Miami was completely confused when a woman he'd been seeing for 2 months suddenly went cold. Instead of begging for her attention, he focused on his social connections, career projects, and personal development, much of which became visible through mutual friends and social media. This authentic value demonstration reawakened her interest far more effectively than any direct pursuit could have. The psychological principle at work is that we value what we might lose more than what actively pursues us. The fourth strategy is what communication experts call pattern interruption. This approach works best for boundary enforcement silence and emotional congruence assessment. Instead of continuing the exact same approach that preceded her withdrawal, introduce a significant pattern change that demonstrates awareness and adaptability. This doesn't mean grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It means substantive shifts in how you engage that address the underlying issue her silence is communicating. Logan from Seattle had been texting a woman consistently for weeks when she suddenly stopped responding. Through coaching, he realized their communication had fallen into a superficial pattern despite her subtle attempts to deepen the connection. Rather than sending another generic "hey" text, he implemented pattern interruption, sharing a genuine challenge he was facing and asking for her perspective. This immediately broke the silence because it addressed the actual issue: lack of emotional depth that had triggered her withdrawal. The fifth response strategy is what behavioral psychologists call high-value re-engagement. This works particularly well when silence has extended beyond your time-bounded patience period or when other approaches haven't produced results. The key is reinitiating contact in a way that adds value rather than seeking validation. Instead of asking questions about her silence or expressing frustration, share something genuinely interesting, funny, or valuable that stands on its own merit. This approach respects both her autonomy and your self-worth simultaneously. Noah from Austin had been completely ghosted by someone he'd been dating for several weeks. After giving appropriate space, he re-engaged not with questions or accusations, but by sharing a documentary recommendation related to an interest she'd previously mentioned. This value-first approach removed the awkwardness of addressing the silence directly, while creating an easy pathway back to communication. The psychological principle here is that value-based re-engagement removes the social friction that often prevents resumption of contact after extended silence. While these response strategies are powerful, your internal mindset during her silence is equally crucial. The first mindset shift is what psychologists call outcome independence. This means emotionally detaching from any specific result of the situation. Whether she resumes communication tomorrow or never speaks to you again, your sense of worth and well-being remains intact. This isn't a tea about pretending not to care. It's about recognizing that your value doesn't depend on any single person's response to you. Paradoxically, this emotional freedom often creates the confident energy that makes her most likely to re-engage. I worked with Ethan from Denver, who was obsessively checking his phone after a woman he'd been dating for a month suddenly went silent. Every hour without response deepened his anxiety and desperation. By developing outcome independence, focusing on his own goals and social connections while accepting he couldn't control her response, he created the psychological space for either outcome. When she eventually reached out a week later, his balanced response actually deepened her interest, rather than pushing her away. The second essential mindset is what behavioral scientists call abundance mentality. This means genuinely understanding that your relationship possibilities extend far beyond this specific person. Her silence might feel catastrophic if you are operating from scarcity, believing she represents your only chance at connection. Abundance mentality recognizes that compatible partners exist in multiple directions if this particular connection doesn't resolve positively. This is about diminishing her value. It's about maintaining proper perspective about your options and worth. Connor from Philadelphia was completely derailed when a woman he'd been talking to for just 2 weeks suddenly stopped responding. His scarcity mentality magnified this minor event into a major emotional crisis. By consciously cultivating abundance thinking, continuing to meet new people while maintaining perspective about this early-stage connection, he created the emotional stability that paradoxically made him more attractive when she eventually reached out again. Abundance mentality prevents the desperate energy that often permanently destroys chances of reconnection. The third crucial mindset shift is what psychologists call negative visualization. This stoic practice involves mentally accepting the worst possible outcome, that she never responds again, and recognizing you would still be fundamentally okay. By removing the catastrophic fear associated with permanent silence, you free yourself from the desperate behaviors that often guarantee that very outcome. This isn't pessimism. It's psychological preparation that creates emotional resilience during uncertainty. Luke from Nashville was paralyzed with anxiety when the woman he'd been seeing for 3 months suddenly stopped responding after what seemed like a perfect weekend together. Through negative visualization, he fully accepted she might never contact him again and mentally worked through how he would move forward in that scenario. This psychological acceptance created the calm confidence that allowed him to implement the external strategies we've discussed without the desperate energy that typically sabotages them. The sixth response strategy for recurring silence patterns is what relationship experts call direct calibration. After the current silent period resolves, calmly establish expectations around communication during emotional processing or conflict. This isn't a tea about making demands. It's about expressing personal boundaries while acknowledging her needs. I understand sometimes you need space to process feelings, and I respect that. I just need a quick heads-up text that you were taking some time rather than complete silence so I don't worry about your safety. Jason from Chicago was dating someone with a pattern of going completely silent for days after minor disagreements. Once they reconnected, he used direct calibration to express his needs. I completely respect when you need space, but complete silence for days makes me worry something serious happened to you. Even a quick text saying, "I need some time to think," would help me understand what's happening. This established a healthier pattern that respected both her need for processing space and his need for basic communication context. Understanding these dynamics transforms not just how you handle female silence, but your entire approach to dating and relationships. Instead of being constantly thrown off balance by her communication patterns, you develop the ability to respond effectively to the underlying psychology rather than just the surface behavior. This creates a foundation of emotional stability that actually prevents many forms of testing silence from emerging in the first place. The transformation this creates in your dating life is profound. No more agonizing uncertainty when she goes quiet. No more reactive behaviors that destroy potential connections. No more misinterpreting normal female communication patterns as rejection or disinterest. Instead, you navigate these moments with confidence and clarity, often turning what would have been relationship-ending misunderstandings into opportunities for deeper connection. If you've found value in understanding what she's really thinking when she goes silent, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more insights into female psychology and relationship dynamics. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with female silence. How did you handle it? And what was the outcome? Your experiences help other men learn and grow in this critical area of life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore more powerful insights into female psychology that transform your relationship success.